Have you ever imagined what it was like to face a warrior so fearless, so relentless, that even the most powerful armies hesitated to challenge them? These were not just leaders. They were legends, battle-hardened fighters who struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. From the deserts of the Southwest to the vast plains of the North, 3 warriors rose to become the most feared men of their time. Their names alone sent chills down the spines of soldiers and settlers alike. This is the story of Geronimo, Red Cloud, and Sitting Bull, 3 of the deadliest Native American warriors in history. Before we dive into these legendary warriors, I need your help. I'm on a mission to reach 700 subscribers within the next month, and you can be part of this journey. If you love hearing about fearless warriors, epic battles, and untold stories from history, then this is a channel for you. Subscribing not only helps grow this community, but it also ensures you never miss incredible stories of the past. So, if you're ready to explore the lives of history's most dangerous warriors, hit that subscribe button right now. Let's enjoy history together. In the heart of the unforgiving Southwest, where the sun scorches the land and the wind carries whispers of ancient spirits, one name stood above all others: Geronimo, a warrior, a leader, a ghost that could never be caught. To his people, he was a savior. To his enemies, he was a nightmare. Born in 1829 among the Chiricahua Apache, Geronimo grew up in a world of war. His people had fought off invaders for centuries, resisting the Spanish, the Mexicans, and now the Americans. He was not a chief, but he was something even more dangerous. A man fueled by vengeance. A man with nothing left to lose. His hatred for the Mexicans began in 1851. He and his band had traveled to trade, leaving their families in a small camp near the town of Llanos. When they returned, the ground was soaked in blood. Women, children, even the elderly, all slaughtered. And among the dead was his mother, his wife, and his 3 children. They had been butchered by Mexican soldiers under the command of Colonel Jose Maria Carrasco. Geronimo did not cry. He did not break. He burned. That night, he wandered into the wilderness, away from his people, away from everything. And there, in the blackness of the desert, he claimed to have heard a voice that told him he would never be killed by a bullet, that no enemy could take his life. And when he returned, he was no longer just a warrior. He was something more, something the world had never seen before. With nothing but a knife and his fury, Geronimo led his warriors into Mexico. There would be no mercy. They struck under the cover of darkness, attacking settlements, ambushing patrols, spilling blood wherever they went. The Mexican soldiers who had slaughtered his family would know his pain 100 times over. They raided villages, looted supplies, and vanished into mountains before their enemies could react. It was during these raids that he earned his name. As he charged into battle, fearless and relentless, Mexican soldiers cried out to St. Jerome for protection. "Geronimo! Geronimo!" they screamed, as if their prayers could stop him. But nothing could. The name stuck, and soon the entire border trembled at its sound. But vengeance was only the beginning. As time passed, Geronimo became more than just a warrior. He became a symbol of resistance. The Americans had pushed deeper into Apache land, breaking treaties, building forts, driving his people from the land of their ancestors. Geronimo would not stand by and watch his people be caged. He led his warriors against the U.S. Army, striking swiftly, disappearing into the wilderness, always one step ahead. No fort was safe, no supply train untouchable. His warriors rode like ghosts through the desert, crossing mountains, rivers, entire territories in a single night. The Americans sent their best soldiers after him. They built telegraph lines to track his movements. They used Apache scouts against him. But no matter how many times they thought they had him, he always escaped. For decades, Geronimo waged a war that no man should have been able to fight. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and hunted by 2 nations. And yet, he could not be caught. Some said he had magic, that he could see the future, that he could outrun bullets. Others said he was simply the greatest warrior the Apache had ever known. But one thing was certain: the legend of Geronimo had only just begun. The Americans sent thousands of soldiers after him, generals who had fought in the Civil War, officers who had battled the greatest armies of their time. And yet, none of them could capture Geronimo. He was always one step ahead, moving like a ghost through the mountains and deserts, striking without warning and vanishing before the enemy could react. By the late 1870s, the U.S. Army believed they had finally broken the Apache resistance. Most of the Chiricahua Apache had been forced onto reservations, and their leaders had surrendered, but not Geronimo. He refused to kneel, refused to be caged like an animal. In 1878, after years of relentless pursuit, Geronimo was finally forced to surrender. The Army sent him to San Carlos Reservation in Arizona, a place known to the Apache as Hell's 40 Acres. The land was dry and lifeless, the heat unbearable. Soldiers watched their every move, and rations were barely enough to survive. But worse than the suffering was the loss of freedom. For 4 years, Geronimo lived under the watchful eye of the U.S. military. But he was not broken. He was waiting, watching. And in 1881, when the moment came, he made his move. Under the cover of darkness, Geronimo and a small band of warriors slipped away from the reservation. By the time the soldiers realized what had happened, he was gone. Once again, he was free. And once again, the war had begun. With only a few dozen warriors, Geronimo waged a campaign of terror across Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. He struck military outposts, raided settlements, and burned supply trains. He and his warriors moved faster than anyone thought possible, traveling hundreds of miles in just days. They could survive on little food, endure blistering heat, and fight outnumbered against overwhelming odds. For the U.S. Army, it was an embarrassment. Thousands of soldiers were hunting a man with only a handful of warriors, yet they could not capture him. Apache scouts were sent to track him, but Geronimo knew their tactics. He could read the land, predict his enemies' movements, and always stay ahead. The newspapers called him the Devil of the Southwest. Civilians lived in fear. Soldiers were terrified to face him in battle. And despite his small numbers, the U.S. government considered him one of the greatest threats in the West. By 1885, the war had reached its peak. The U.S. Army launched a massive campaign to capture Geronimo once and for all. 5,000 soldiers, a quarter of the entire U.S. Army, were sent to hunt him down. The Mexican Army joined the pursuit. Apache scouts were bribed to track him, but even with the full force of two nations against him, Geronimo would not surrender. He led his warriors deeper into the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico, a vast and treacherous wilderness that no army dared enter. For months, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse, evading capture, striking back when least expected. He had only 36 warriors left, but they fought as if they were an army of 1,000. But even the strongest warrior cannot fight forever. After years of endless pursuit, Geronimo's people were exhausted. His warriors were tired, his supplies were running low, and he knew that the army would never stop hunting him. If he continued to fight his people, his wives, his children, the last free Apache would all be hunted down and killed. In September 1886, under the weight of impossible odds, Geronimo made the hardest decision of his life. He agreed to meet with General Nelson Miles, but he did not come as a broken man. He came as a warrior, standing tall, his eyes burning with defiance. He made one final demand. He would surrender, but only if his people were treated fairly. Miles agreed, but like every promise made before, it was a lie. Geronimo and his people were not allowed to return to their homeland. Instead, they were taken as prisoners of war, loaded onto trains and sent to Florida. The land of deserts and mountains was replaced by swamps and disease. Many did not survive. Geronimo had fought for freedom his entire life, and now, for the first time, it had been taken from him. But his legend was far from over. Geronimo sat in the iron prison of a train car, watching the land of his ancestors vanish behind him. He had spent his life outrunning armies, defying death, and fighting for the freedom of his people. But now, he was a prisoner, shackled and exiled from the lands he had sworn to protect. His warriors, his wives, his children, all torn away from the only home they had ever known. The last free Apache were gone. They were taken east, far from the deserts and mountains that had given them strength. First to Florida, where the humid swamps were nothing like the dry, open lands of the Southwest. The Apache, a people built for the harsh arid terrain of the West, fell victim to disease in the damp, suffocating climate. The old and the weak perished first, their bodies unable to fight off the sickness that spread through their camps. Malaria, tuberculosis, starvation. The prisoners of war were treated like criminals, guarded night and day, given barely enough food to survive. Geronimo watched his people suffer, but he did not beg for mercy. He had lived through massacres, betrayals, and endless war. He had seen his family slaughtered, his homeland stolen, his brothers in arms hunted like animals. And yet he endured. The warrior who had defied two nations refused to break. After years of suffering in Florida, the government moved him again, this time to Alabama, to the Mount Vernon barracks, where the Apache prisoners were forced into hard labor. They were given axes and shovels, ordered to clear land, build roads, and cut timber under the brutal southern sun. Their bodies grew weaker, their numbers smaller. The great warriors of the Chiricahua were now slaves in a foreign land. Geronimo, once the most feared man in the West, was now a curiosity. People came from miles around just to catch a glimpse of the legendary Apache warrior. Some wanted to see the savage they had read about in the newspapers, the bloodthirsty killer who had terrorized the frontier. Others saw something different, a leader, a survivor, a man who had fought for his people with everything he had. But the government had one more betrayal left. After nearly a decade of captivity, they did not allow Geronimo and his people to return home. Instead, they were sent to Oklahoma, to the Fort Sill military reservation. The land was dry and barren, but it was still a prison. The Apache were forced to become farmers, stripped of their weapons, forbidden from practicing their old ways. They were no longer warriors. They were no longer free. For years, Geronimo lived under the watchful eye of the U.S. military. He adapted, as he always had, but he never forgot who he was. He wore the clothes of a farmer, but he never let go of his warrior spirit. He found ways to keep his people alive, to protect their traditions in secret. The fire inside him never died. As time passed, Geronimo became more than just a warrior. He became a legend. The world had changed, but his name had not been forgotten. He was invited to fairs, exhibitions, and events across the country, where thousands of Americans came to see him. At the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, he sat under a tent, selling autographs and photographs of himself. The man who had once terrorized the frontier now smiled for tourists, signing his name in a language that was not his own. Some say he regretted surrendering, that in his final years, he longed for the days when he rode free, when the mountains and deserts were his command. Others say he saw the truth, that the war had already been lost long before he laid down his rifle, that no matter how fiercely he had fought, no matter how many soldiers he had outwitted, no man could stop the tide of history. But even in captivity, he remained defiant. When President Theodore Roosevelt met him in 1905, Geronimo asked one final time to return to his homeland. He did not ask for himself. He asked for his people, for the few Chiricahua Apache who still survived. Roosevelt refused. The Apache would never return to the land of their ancestors. In 1909, at the age of 79, Geronimo fell from his horse on a cold winter night. He lay on the ground, alone, shivering in the frost. By the time someone found him, it was too late. Pneumonia had set in. As he lay dying, he whispered to his nephew that he regretted surrendering, that he should have fought until the very end. And then, the last great warrior of the Apache was gone. Geronimo was buried at Fort Sill, in the land of his captivity. He had been a prisoner for over 20 years, longer than he had fought as a free warrior. But his legend never faded. To this day, his name is a symbol of defiance, of strength, of a man who refused to be tamed. The man who had outrun armies, who had defied death, who had become a ghost in the desert, still lives on, not as a prisoner, not as a relic of the past, but as the last free Apache. Geronimo's relentless war against the U.S. and Mexican forces made him a legend, but he wasn't the only warrior to bring an army to its knees. Far to the north, across the vast plains, another leader emerged, one who didn't just fight battles, but won an entire war. With brilliant strategy and fearless warriors, he did what no other native leader had done. He forced the U.S. government into a peace treaty on his terms. This is the story of Red Cloud, the man who defeated the U.S. Army in open war. The winter of 1822 was harsh on the northern plains. Snow covered the rolling prairies, and the biting wind cut to the hides of Lakota lodges. It was in this unforgiving world that a child was born, a child who would one day lead his people in one of the greatest wars against the United States. His name was Mapia Luda. The white men would come to know him as Red Cloud. Red Cloud was born into the Oglala Lakota, a people known for their strength, their skill in war, and their deep spiritual connection to the land. But unlike many great leaders, he was not born into a chief's family. His father, Lone Man, was a warrior of modest status, and his mother, Walks As She Thinks, came from the Brule Lakota, a neighboring band. Though his father's blood did not carry him toward leadership, his mother's relatives, especially her brother, Old Chief Smoke, would shape his destiny. Fate, however, was cruel. When Red Cloud was still a child, his father died. Left without a father's guidance, he was raised by his maternal uncle, Chief Smoke, a powerful and respected leader. From an early age, Red Cloud was taught the way of the warrior, not just how to fight, but how to think, how to track, how to survive. Strength was respected, but cunning was feared. He learned both. The young Red Cloud grew up watching his people wage war. The Lakota were not just fighting the encroaching settlers. They had long battled their rivals, the Crow, the Pawnee, and the Shoshone, for control of the Great Plains. Every year, raiding parties set out to steal horses, take scalps, and prove their bravery. To a boy like Red Cloud, war was not a distant thing. It was all around him. By the time he was a teenager, he was eager to prove himself. He did not have the birthright of a chief's son, but he had something just as valuable, an iron will and a thirst for glory. When he was old enough to join war parties, he fought with a ferocity that caught the attention of his elders. He did not simply charge into battle. He studied his enemies, anticipated their moves, and struck when they least expected. He took scalps, stole horses, and killed with precision. By his early 20s, his name was already whispered with respect. But it was in his war against the Pawnee that Red Cloud first showed the ruthless cunning that would define his legacy. Unlike many young warriors, he did not seek battle for the thrill of it. He fought to win. He learned the tactics of ambush, striking at the enemy's weakest points, forcing them into traps, cutting off their escape routes. He did not fight for honor alone. He fought for total victory. One battle stood out among many. The Pawnee had raided deep into Lakota lands, stealing horses and leaving a trail of destruction. Red Cloud, still a young warrior but already commanding respect, gathered a force and pursued them. When he found their camp, he did not attack immediately. He waited, studied their defenses, and struck in the dead of night. His warriors moved like shadows, surrounding the camp before the Pawnee even realized they were there. By the time the sun rose, the enemy was slaughtered. The few survivors who escaped carried the message. Red Cloud was not to be underestimated. His reputation soared. He was no longer just a warrior. He was a leader of men, but he was not yet a chief. That would take time, and more importantly, it would take something greater than victories against rival tribes. By the 1850s, Red Cloud had seen what the white men brought. They came with their wagons, their traders, their treaties. They spoke of peace, yet they built forts in the heart of Lakota land. At first, the whites were tolerated. They were few, and they kept to their paths. But Red Cloud watched as more came, and with them, their endless hunger for land. He saw what had happened to the eastern tribes, the Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Potawatomi driven from their homes, forced to march west like cattle. The Lakota were different. They would not be moved. Red Cloud had no illusions about what was coming. The United States was growing, its power immense. But he also knew something else. The white men did not understand the land like the Lakota did. They built their forts, but those forts were isolated, vulnerable. They had guns, but their soldiers were soft, untested in the ways of the plains. If war came, Red Cloud believed it could be won. But to fight an empire, he would need more than warriors. He would need to unite his people. The Lakota were powerful but divided. The Oglala, the Brule, the Hunkpapa, the Minneconjou, yet they did not always act as one. Red Cloud knew that if the Americans were to be stopped, the Lakota had to stand together. And not just the Lakota, their allies, the Cheyenne and Arapaho, would have to join them. It was a near impossible task. But if anyone could do it, it was him. By 1860, the war drums were beating. The United States was distracted, fighting its own civil war in the East. But Red Cloud knew that once that war ended, the soldiers would come west in greater numbers than ever before. The time to act was approaching. He would not wait for the Americans to tighten their grip. He would strike first. Red Cloud was not yet a chief, but soon the Lakota would look to him for leadership. And when the time came, he would not hesitate. The greatest war of his life was about to begin. The fires burned low in Lakota camp, casting flickering shadows against the hide walls of the lodges. Red Cloud sat among his warriors, his face impassive, his eyes sharp. He had called this council for one reason. War was coming. The white men had broken their promises too many times. They had come with their treaties, their gifts, their false words of peace. But now, they came with something else. Outposts. To the white men, a fort was a symbol of protection, a place to rest and regroup, a foothold in a hostile land. To Red Cloud, it was an invasion. These wooden outposts, built along the Bozeman Trail, were an insult, a challenge, a declaration of war. The trail, which cut to the Powder River country, was sacred land, Lakota land. And now, the Americans were building forts right in the heart of it. Red Cloud had spent years watching the slow encroachment of the whites. He had listened at councils, heard the words of their agents and generals. They spoke of friendship, of peace, yet behind their backs, they drew maps, marked trails, and sent surveyors deeper into Lakota territory. By the early 1860s, the warning signs were clear. Settlers were moving west in greater numbers, and with them came soldiers. The discovery of gold in Montana had drawn thousands of prospectors, eager to carve their fortunes from the earth. The easiest route to the gold fields was the Bozeman Trail, which cut directly through some of the best Lakota hunting grounds. The whites needed the trail. Red Cloud needed it closed. Then came the forts. The first, Fort Reno, was built in 1865, a wooden stronghold in the heart of Lakota country. Red Cloud knew what it meant. Where the soldiers built one fort, they would build another. Soon after came Fort Phil Kearny, then Fort C.F. Smith. These were no longer small trading posts or temporary outposts. These were permanent settlements, built to house soldiers and supplies, to protect the flow of white men pushing deeper into the land. Red Cloud did not wait. He gathered his warriors, Oglala, Minneconjou, Hung Papa. He called on the Cheyenne and Arapaho, longtime allies of Lakota. This was not a time for small skirmishes, for raids and horse theft. This was a time for war. But Red Cloud was not reckless. He was a warrior. But more than that, he was a strategist. He knew the American way of war. He had seen how they fought, how they moved in columns, how they relied on their forts as lifelines. He did not have their guns, their endless supplies, their artillery. But he had something else. He had the land. The Powder River country was vast and untamed. The soldiers did not know it as the Lakota did. They were outsiders in a land that had never welcomed them. The rivers, the ravines, the rolling plains, these were Red Cloud's weapons. The Americans might have their forts, but those forts were islands in a sea of Lakota warriors. And Red Cloud would make them bleed for every mile they tried to take. In 1866, the United States called for a peace council at Fort Laramie. They wanted to end hostilities, to negotiate, to find some way to keep their forts and their trail without sparking a full-scale war. Many Lakota leaders attended. Some even considered the offer. But Red Cloud saw the truth. He listened to their words, but his mind was already made up. The moment he learned that the U.S. was sending more troops and supplies up the Bozeman Trail, even as they spoke of peace, he rose from the council, his face set in stone. "There will be no peace," he said. Then he turned and rode away. The war had begun. Red Cloud wasted no time. He organized his warriors into small, fast-moving bands, striking at wagon trains, harassing scouting parties, cutting off supply lines. The soldiers were not used to fighting an enemy they could not see. They marched out from their forts in force. But the Lakota did not meet them in open battle. They attacked from the hills, the tree lines, the ravines. They struck at night, vanishing before the sun rose. By the summer of 1866, the Bozeman Trail was no longer safe. White settlers who tried to cross it were slaughtered. Supply wagons were burned. Soldiers patrolling outside their forts were ambushed and killed. The forts had become prisons, outposts surrounded by enemies, cut off from the world beyond their wooden walls. Then came the greatest test. In December 1866, Captain William Fetterman led a detachment of 81 soldiers out from Fort Phil Kearny. He was arrogant, convinced that no force of Lakota could defeat him. "Give me 80 men," he reportedly boasted, "and I'll ride to the whole Sioux Nation." Red Cloud was waiting. The plan was simple. A small band of Lakota warriors, including Crazy Horse, a young warrior already proving himself in battle, would lure Fetterman's force away from the fort, drawing them into a trap. The soldiers, eager for battle, took the bait. They chased the fleeing warriors over the ridge, beyond the site of the fort. And there, waiting in the hills, were over 1,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. The ambush was swift and brutal. The soldiers barely had time to react before they were surrounded. Gunfire erupted. Arrows rained down. War cries filled the air. The fight did not last long. Fetterman and every one of his men were killed to the last man. Their bodies were stripped, scalped, and left as a warning to those who would come after. The Fetterman Massacre, as the whites would call it, sent shockwaves through the U.S. Army. This was no small skirmish. This was a disaster. The forts were under siege, the Bozeman Trail was impassable, and Red Cloud had proven that the Lakota could not only fight the U.S. Army, but defeat it. For the next year, Red Cloud's war raged on. More soldiers were sent, more attacks were launched, but the result was always the same. The forts remained isolated, the trail remained closed, and the cost of the war grew too high for the U.S. government to bear. In 1868, the United States finally did what no one had thought possible. They surrendered. The Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed, and the U.S. agreed to abandon the forts and close the Bozeman Trail. It was the only war in American history where the U.S. conceded defeat and withdrew from native land. Red Cloud had won. Red Cloud won his war. But another battle was just beginning. While some leaders chose diplomacy, others prepared for the inevitable. The final brutal struggle for the Great Plains. And at the heart of that fight stood a chief whose name would become legend. He didn't just command warriors. He inspired them, uniting thousands to stand against the might of the U.S. military. His vision led to one of the most shocking victories in American history, the defeat of General Custer at Little Bighorn. This is the story of Sitting Bull, the warrior, the leader, the last great defender of his people. The vast Great Plains stretch endlessly under an open sky. Wind rustles through the tall grass, and in the distance, a herd of buffalo moves like a dark wave across the land. The Lakota people have called this place home for generations, but change is coming. For centuries, the Lakota have thrived as nomadic hunters and fierce warriors, following the great herds that provide them with food, clothing, and shelter. Their lives are guided by tradition, by spirits, by the wisdom of their elders. Among them, one boy will rise to change history. His name is Tatanka Iotake. The world will know him as Sitting Bull. Born in 1831, Sitting Bull grows up in a time of power and prosperity for his people. His father returns again, is a respected warrior. His mother, her holy door, teaches him the ways of his ancestors. As a child, he is given the name Jumping Badger. From the start, he is different, quiet, observant, thoughtful. Like all Lakota boys, he learns to ride before he can run. He listens to the stories of his elders, learning the histories of battles fought and won. But it is not enough to listen. A warrior must prove himself in battle. At 14, he rides with his father's war party against their traditional enemy, the Crow. The battle is fierce, the air thick with dust, the screams of warriors rising above the clash of weapons. In the chaos, Jumping Badger spots an enemy fighter. He does not hesitate. He charges, striking his first kill. When he returns to camp, he is no longer Jumping Badger. He is given a new name, Sitting Bull, a name of power, a name of destiny. Over the years, Sitting Bull rises as a leader, not just in battle, but in wisdom. He is not reckless. He is not driven by rage. He is a man who sees beyond the moment, and what he sees troubles him. The world is changing. The buffalo are growing scarce. White settlers are moving west, claiming the land as their own. Treaties are signed, then broken. The Lakota are being pushed aside, forced onto smaller and smaller lands. Then, something happens that will shake the very foundation of their world. Gold is discovered in the Black Hills, a sacred land promised to the Lakota forever. But forever, as Sitting Bull knows, means nothing to the white man. Miners flood into the hills. The army follows, protecting them, driving deeper into Lakota land. The government demands that the Lakota leave, that they surrender their sacred land. But Sitting Bull does not believe in surrender. As tensions rise, warriors from across the plains gather. Hunkpapa, Oglala, Mini Kanju, Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians. A great village forms, the largest in Lakota history, and the U.S. Army is coming for them. One man leads them, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. He believes the Lakota will scatter before him. He believes he is riding toward victory. But Sitting Bull knows better. A storm is coming, and history is about to be written in blood. The sun rises over the Great Plains. A massive Lakota village stretches across the valley, thousands of teepees standing together in the morning light. Warriors paint their faces, preparing their weapons. Women cook, children play, elders watch the horizon. A sense of unease lingers in the air. They know the soldiers are coming. Sitting Bull stands at the center of the camp. He does not prepare for battle with weapons, but with prayer. He lifts his pipe to the sky, offering smoke to Wakantanka, the Great Spirit. The people gather, listening as he speaks. He tells them of his vision. He has seen the blue-coated soldiers falling, their bodies covering the ground like grass after a storm. The Lakota will triumph. Hundreds of miles away, Lieutenant George Armstrong Custer rides toward history. He is a man of ambition, eager for glory, confident in his own invincibility. He leads his men of the 7th Cavalry through the rolling hills of Montana Territory, unaware that he is walking into a battle he cannot win. June 25, 1876. The sun climbs high in the sky. Custer's scouts spot the great village. Thousands of warriors, more than they expected. But Custer does not hesitate. He divides his command, ordering an attack. He believes the Lakota will panic. He believes they will run. He is wrong. From the tall grass, warriors emerge like spirits of the earth. Arrows fly. Gunfire cracks. The air fills with the thunder of hooves, the screams of men. The battle erupts in chaos. Crazy Horse leads a furious charge, his warriors cutting through Custer's men like a river breaking through stone. Gall, another Lakota leader, strikes from another side. The soldiers are surrounded. There is no escape. Sitting Bull does not fight on the battlefield that day. He is the heart of his people, the guiding force behind their resistance. His vision has come true. The white soldiers fall. Custer, the golden-haired general, lies dead among his men. It is the greatest victory the Lakota have ever known, the greatest defeat the U.S. Army has ever suffered at the hands of native warriors. The people celebrate. They have defended their land. But Sitting Bull knows this victory will not last. The white men do not accept defeat. They will return in greater numbers with more weapons, with more hunger. The land, the freedom of his people, everything is now in greater danger than ever before. In Washington, the news of Custer's defeat spreads like wildfire. The government is outraged. They send more soldiers, more pressure, more war. The Lakota are hunted, their villages burned, their way of life destroyed piece by piece. Sitting Bull refuses to surrender. He leads his people north, toward the only place they might be safe, toward Canada. But the long journey is only the beginning of another battle, one that cannot be fought with weapons, one that will test the spirit of a leader, and the survival of a nation. The fires of victory have burned out. The echoes of triumph at the Little Bighorn fade into the wind. Now, there is only survival. The United States government is relentless. The defeat of Custer has enraged them. More soldiers flood the plains, sweeping through Lakota lands, burning villages, destroying food supplies, hunting the people like animals. The great Lakota alliance that once stood strong begins to break apart. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear take their toll. Sitting Bull refuses to bend. He will not surrender. He will not sign treaties that mean nothing. He gathers his people, those who still believe in freedom, and turns north. Canada, a land beyond the reach of the U.S. Army, a place where they may find peace. The journey is brutal. Weeks of travel across endless plains, freezing nights, little food. The buffalo are vanishing, slaughtered by white hunters for sport, for profit. The people grow weaker, but Sitting Bull does not stop. He leads them forward. In the fall of 1877, they cross the border. They stand on new land, tired but undefeated. The Canadian government does not send soldiers to attack them. Instead, they send representatives, offering words, offering peace. For a time, there is calm. The Lakota rest. They hunt. They live. But it is not the same. The buffalo are scarce here, too. The cold is harsher. The land is foreign. And across the border, the U.S. government waits. Years pass. The Lakota in America suffer, starving, isolated, one by one. Their leaders surrender. Crazy Horse is murdered under a soldier's bayonet. Gall, once a fierce warrior, gives in, leading his people to the reservations. The dream of a free Lakota nation is dying. U.S. officials send messages to Sitting Bull. They tell him his people need him. They tell him to come back, to surrender. But he knows the truth. There is no freedom on the reservations. Only fences, only rules, only broken promises. Then, the final blow. In 1881, the Canadian government tells him they will no longer help his people. They are not citizens. They must leave. He has no choice. His people are starving. The dream is over. On July 19, 1881, Sitting Bull rides south. He crosses the border, back into the land of his ancestors. He does not bring an army. He brings only his people. At Fort Buford, he steps forward unshaken. He looks the soldiers in the eye. And then, the unthinkable, he hands over his rifle. "I wish it to be remembered," he says, "that I was the last man of my tribe to surrender my rifle. The war is over." But Sitting Bull's fight is not. The battle for the Lakota spirit is just beginning. Sitting Bull is no longer a free man. He is now a prisoner of the United States government. When he surrenders at Fort Buford in 1881, he is sent to Fort Randall, where he is held captive for nearly 2 years. He is not treated as a warrior, nor as a leader, but as a conquered enemy, the great chief of the Lakota, who once defied the most powerful army in the world, now lives under the watchful eyes of soldiers. But Sitting Bull does not break. He does not beg. He does not bow. Even in chains, he remains a symbol of defiance. In 1883, he is sent to the Standing Rock Reservation, a stretch of land along the Missouri River in what is now North and South Dakota. It is nothing like the open plains of his youth. There are no great buffalo herds, no vast grasslands stretching to the horizon. There are fences. There are rules. There is dependence on government rations. Sitting Bull refuses to become a farmer, as the government demands. He refuses to be tamed. He speaks out against the agents who oversee the reservation, men who treat the Lakota as if they are children, incapable of deciding their own future. He is watched closely, seen as a troublemaker, a threat. But then, an opportunity, a strange one. In 1885, he is invited to join Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show, a traveling spectacle that brings cowboys and Indians before cheering crowds in the eastern cities. At first, he refuses. But then he sees the truth. This is a way to show the world that the Lakota still exist, that their spirit is not broken. For 4 months, he rides and parades, dressed in full regalia, a living legend on display. Crowds cheer. People reach out to touch him. Some call him a murderer, a savage. Others see him as a hero. But Sitting Bull sees them all for what they are: curious, disconnected, unaware of the suffering his people endure. He meets President Grover Cleveland. He shakes his hand, but he does not beg for anything. He does not ask for help. He simply watches, listens, judges. And then he returns home. By now, life on the reservation is worse than ever. The government has taken more land. Rations have been cut. The people are desperate. And then hope arrives, hope in the form of a new vision, a new belief. The Ghost Dance. A spiritual movement spreads across the reservations. A promise that the old world will return, that the buffalo will come back, that the white men will be swept away. The people dance for days, believing they will become invincible. The U.S. government sees it as a threat. And Sitting Bull, though skeptical, does not stop it. He does not dance, but he does not discourage his people from believing in something greater than their suffering. For this, the government sees him as dangerous. On December 15, 1890, Indian police arrive at his cabin before dawn. They are there to arrest him, to silence him once and for all. But Sitting Bull does not go quietly. A scuffle breaks out. Shots are fired. And then the great Lakota leader falls. Tatanka Iotake, Sitting Bull, is dead. The man who defied the U.S. Army, who led his people in their greatest victory, who refused to surrender until there was no other choice, has been killed, not by soldiers, but by his own people, acting under orders from the government. His death does not end the suffering of the Lakota. 2 weeks later, the massacre at Wounded Knee will claim the lives of hundreds of men, women, and children. The final, brutal chapter of the Indian Wars. But Sitting Bull's story does not end in death. His spirit lives on. His name, his legacy, his fight never forgotten. He remains a symbol of resistance, of strength, of a people who refuse to vanish. The wind still moves across the Great Plains. The buffalo are gone, but the land remembers. And somewhere, in the rustling grass, in the whispering wind, his voice still echoes. A warrior, a leader, a legend. Sitting Bull rides on,